Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm Beth Bailey, and today I'm so excited to be joined by Will Selber, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force and a volunteer with the non-governmental organization Operation Sacred Promise, which works to evacuate members of the Afghan Air Force and the Army Special Mission Wing from Afghanistan. Well, it's really exciting to have you here tonight. We're going to be talking about the phenomenon of moral injury, which has really come into prominence in media, especially in the last year, in the aftermath of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. So thanks for joining tonight.
That was a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So can you start, a lot of us are familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder and other kinds of effects that have war has left on those who practice it. But can you give us a brief description about moral injury? Because I think it's a lesser understood topic.
Yeah, it's been so I'm not no bees an expert on moral injury, but I've done enough research and as somebody who has suffered from it for quite a while. So I would suggest that anybody who really wants to understand moral injury to read two books by Dr. Jonathan Shea, Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America. And he really did a lot of work with Vietnam War veterans. And when he did his research and interviews, he found that really, moral injury occurs when, for veterans, when there is a betrayal, one critical aspect on something of critical importance by someone of higher authority. And those are the three elements that he says are common throughout moral injury. And what that can cause is, deep depression, a questioning of your overall moral worth. And it's usually coincided with, can range for any type of thing from depression to insomnia to having some type of overlap with PTSD. I was diagnosed with combat PTSD in 2006 after my first deployment. And so there's a lot of differences. For me, it is more of the combat PTSD can be more of like a physical symptoms, nightmares, jittery, hyper awareness, hyper vigilance. And really for me and for the friends that I know that have suffered from moral injury, it can be a deep questioning of your overall worth and the overall narrative that you tell yourself about what your service was. So for example, for most veterans, the number one principle that we hold by is that we don't leave anybody behind. No one left behind. And it's in almost all the services, creeds, and mottos. And so for Afghan veterans, the ones that were very involved with Afghans, leaving them behind hits all the things that Jonathan Shea talks about and has created a huge wave of moral injury for thousands of Afghan veterans and also civilians as well who've been involved in the NEO.
Yeah, I can say as someone who I've been working on Afghanistan related things in some capacity or another since 2008. And I always wondered, what was it post evacuation, that feeling of just righteous anger and absolute inability to focus on anything other than that. And how do we fix it? And I still don't know if that particularly is moral injury, but it certainly is a powerful motivator that I see in so many veterans that I speak with, and then in so many civilian volunteers who are just they are motivated by something that is otherworldly almost.
Yeah, I think that it's moral injury is it is something that is just very, very difficult to deal with, and especially if you don't have a lot of people to talk to about it. As Afghan, I spent 3.5 years in Afghanistan on 4 different deployments at the village, the provincial, and the national levels. I was most recently there from June of 2020 to June of 2021 in the Defense Attaché office. When you come back and all of this happens and the vast majority of the country isn't really kind of dialed in on it or what's going on, you feel very much alone, like you're the only one that is going through this huge trauma. And while everybody else around you to your left and right just gets to keep on living their life like nothing really happened. And I think that for many veterans and active duty service members as well, it's that injury of not being able to talk about it and not being able to discuss with people what happened, because something happened and it's a betrayal for many of us of what we pledged our lives to.
That's so huge. And it speaks to the civilian military divide, which
Sure.
is huge in this country. And how do you, I've always advocated for civilians, we say a lot of thank you for your service, but we
Sure.
don't ask. You can't really thank someone if you don't understand what that service was. And
Right.
so few of us are curious enough or care enough to ask those hard questions. I think we've been trained not to at some level, but it is a burden that should be shared, and that that no individual should have to handle alone. And so talking, I think, is very powerful. How can so let's track back to the main methods of talking
Sure.
is one. Let's expand on that. Like,
Yeah, sure.
talking with therapists, how do
Sure.
you is it currently something that's even classified as, PTSD is something that we recognize? Oh, you are
Right.
experiencing PTSD, and here is the course of action that we're going to take
Yeah.
to kind of handle that. Is moral injury in that sphere? It doesn't have a diagnostic
No, it's not in
component
the
now.
DSM. It's not
Okay.
something that you can get a disability rating for the Veterans Affairs. You can get depression added on there, but it's not something that is formally recognized, even though there is an expansive body of literature about it. It's not the first time that this has kind of cropped up. We saw it, in Vietnam. We saw it in parts of the Iraq War, but I think that it was really punctuated by the neo and the chaotic nature of it. And so, talking about it, it is the validation of what happened that so many people really, really crave. It is the big T, the truth that people crave about what happens. And if you read a lot of what Jonathan Shea talks about, it is that for a lot of Vietnam veterans, it was that lack of validation. It was the lack of anybody taking ownership about it. And so for many of them, they blame themselves. And when that vacuum is empty, right, and we don't fill it with what happened, and a validation of that we lost, that we abandoned people, then that vacuum will be filled, right, by things that we don't want active duty service members or veterans or civilians to fill it with. Alcohol, drugs, radicalization, all that type of stuff will fill in that void. And so for moral injuries, yes, there's treatment plans, and a lot of it is talking about it and through all these different means. Therapy is absolutely one of them. Group therapy is another one. But it is something that, in my opinion, is it can have a much bigger effect for a lot of people who than combat PTSD. In my opinion, combat PTSD, we've done a lot of great work on it, and it's got a very big audience. Today, I think, is National PTSD Day, and so there's a lot of tried and true methods to go through, but people are not aware of what moral injury is.
How do you think we can? So, I guess, how do we increase that awareness other than just continuing to talk about it, write about it, especially when there is so little talking about,
Yes,
in this particular case, what has happened, in the neo, in the 2 years since.
yeah, I think so. I think that needs to come from senior DoD and military leaders. As a junior officer commander, I can do so much. I've had very frank conversations with my formations about what happened in Afghanistan, and actually saying that we lost, that we were defeated, and that is a difficult thing for people to say, and for people to hear. It doesn't. None of that means that that people's service wasn't honorable. The vast majority of them were, but we need to take ownership that actually happened, and I think it's as plain as day that it did. And so that needs to be said out loud, and it needs to be said by senior DoD leaders. And then we also need to admit that we abandoned our Afghan allies on the battlefield. It wasn't intentional. Nobody meant to do it. There's a lot of work being done to try to rectify that, but it happened. and it's still going too slowly for a lot. And just those two things said by senior DoD leaders, I think would do a lot of good for a lot of people. And if you look at really, I mean, I've been in for 20 years. The military has totally changed in those 20 years since I've been in, right? I was in when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was around. And now, I just did a Pride 5K as a commander, right? So, I mean, that amount of change is remarkable. I spoke at a University of Texas mental health and behavioral conference a week or so ago, and people were talking about the LGBTQ issues. They were talking about sexual assault. They were talking about suicide and all that type of stuff. But nobody was talking about the war and that we lost it and that we had abandoned our allies. And if we're brave enough to talk about those issues, right, they were so hard for us to talk about, we should be able to talk about this issue too.
Absolutely. What kind of anecdotal or even, I've seen the numbers from the Veterans Affairs that, up to 29% of veterans of our most recent conflicts, Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom, are going to experience PTSD at some point in their lifetimes, which is higher than what they've recorded for Vietnam vets and veterans of other conflicts, which granted, this is a today statistic. And so maybe that is similar, but is there any kind of statistic that you're aware of or any anecdotal evidence that you're aware of that shows kind of the impact or the scale of the impact of moral injury on
so if you look, you have to kind of search for it. More in Common, a nonprofit, did some surveys after the fall, and so if you just look at that, you see like 76% of Afghan veterans are angry about what happened. 69% feel betrayed, and then I think it might have been IAVA did a survey, and it was like 49% or 41% of Afghan veterans have felt trauma since the Afghan Neo. And so those are all indicators. And I would also, if you've read a book called The Inheritance, I think it's by Mara Carlin, and I might be butchering that name, but she really pinpoints on something that I've always seen inside the military. And she talks about contempt that you can feel inside the active duty military. She did about 100 interviews of senior general officers inside the military about the last 20 years of war. And, the quotes that you see is, like, thank you for your service. Really, thank you for not making me think about the war for the last 20 years. So you have all these different things, right? You have anger, you have betrayal. I think it was like 71% felt humiliated. All those things, it is a bad mixture that can really lead to some really bad outcomes if we don't start actually talking about what everybody can see as plain as day.
Yeah, I think it's such a simple solution, right? In theory, but I know it's really tough for some people. I don't know if this person, I'm not going to mention this person by name, but the first person who talked to me, I had to put Afghanistan down entirely in 2013 after I left the intel community, because when I saw the news that the Taliban had raised their flag at their Qatar office for political negotiations, and I couldn't write a report about it or contact somebody and say, what in the hell are we doing? I got irrationally angry. And I realized you can't touch this anymore because you can't do anything about it anymore. And I went back to the past and started focusing on that because it was easier to parse through the past. And so in 2021 springtime, I had a young man I was talking to for an article who had become an amputee in the course of his service. And he told me that the Taliban had just started taking the district where he had lost his limbs. And I really wanted to get him on here to talk about it. And he told me no, like he needed to process it. And by processing it, he just kind of needed to move forward from it. Sure. He couldn't do that anymore. But he was one of the first people to bring me back into, the part that had been hard for me that I couldn't touch for so long. And then, I got, obviously, that's all I do now pretty much is Afghanistan. Because I think it's this once you've started caring about something and you realize that very few people also do, you can't
Yes.
stop.
Right.
It's a very difficult phenomenon. And so all of that background then to say, yes, we need to talk about it, but sometimes talking is really hard. And sometimes it doesn't feel like progress when you're
It doesn't.
talking about it.
Yeah. Sure.
So what do
And I
you
know
do
it's
in
yeah.
that environment?
It's difficult. It's difficult to talk about something like this, and that's why, in my opinion, it's imperative that leaders be the ones that step forward and do it. Um, you know, I talk in the a recent article I wrote on War on the Rocks about moral injury with my mom, Dr. Catherine Selber. And we talk about, we show that, that the military, senior DoD leaders have done this in the past. General Goldfein, Chief Wright, did this a series of conversations after the George Floyd murders, and just really having a frank and open conversation. And that created a permission structure, right, all the way down. And so that now, I mean, we have frequent talks about race in America inside of the military. Uh, and even just a simple, just like a senior DoD leader coming out and saying that something went wrong can also have a great effect. Like General Milley coming out and saying that he didn't do everything right after the Lafayette Square incident. I think those are two examples right there of leadership, and you know by having senior DoD leaders do it on this thing, it will help other commanders like myself to go out and be the ones to talk about it. I've been talking about it for, I wrote my first article about it for the Bulwark on the 1 year anniversary of the fall of Afghanistan, called A Terrible Year. And I did a series of talks throughout my formation, and the amount of feedback I've had from soldiers, sailors, Marines, veterans has been remarkable. And so I think it's hard, but we have to start doing it.
How are they feeling? What did they say to you in that feedback?
Anger, anger. So I did a briefing that conference that I mentioned earlier, and I had somebody who wrote this heartfelt email to me. Um, she said that she was in the audience and she started crying and she had to leave because she had been involved in the evac efforts, and she was like, "I didn't think anybody was ever going to talk about this ever. I didn't think it was ever going to be talked about. I thought it was just something that happened and nobody was going to say that this was wrong." I think that there is a lot of fear that that we're going to be like, this person is to blame. I think we can have lessons learned and point out things that we didn't do right, and that's important as well. But for me personally, and for a lot of people that I've talked to, like, I think everybody knows that it's not just one person that happened, right? And so that I don't think that's what most people are looking for, to pin it on one person. And so if we actually talk about the collective we, the things that we did wrong, because society is supposed to go to war together, especially in the United States, and maybe that didn't happen. So we're all to blame for what happened in Afghanistan. That's my standard line. I'm accountable. I spent 3.5 years there. I made mistakes. And I think that if we can hold ourselves accountable and we can start talking about what happened, we can not only start to heal some of our veterans' moral injury, but we can actually make sure that in 20 years from now, we're not making the same mistakes in another irregular war, like what happened after Vietnam, when we did not learn from our mistakes and put the war lessons aside and said that we were just going to focus on the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Oh, I can't even the number of Vietnam-esque programs that were tried in Afghanistan
Yeah.
that had not worked before.
Yeah.
It's pretty astounding. And then
Sure.
I think it's all so important. And like you said, it's no one person is to blame here. This is a
Right.
whole thing. And I think it's very important to talk about this with the point of moving
Sure.
forward for the people who feel guilty, who feel
Yes.
angry, who feel betrayed, and
Yes.
moving forward for a country that wants to do better. And all I see, and as time goes on, I think that all that anyone sees is all we want to do is burying it is only going to increase those feelings of guilt, anger, frustration, like you said, lead people to extremist groups
Yes.
or alcohol or drugs or whatever, to deal with those very, very difficult feelings rather than just at this point, honestly, and I've said this on the podcast before too, I've never seen anything bring people from different political parties
Oh
together
yeah.
like Afghanistan has.
Oh yeah.
This, if the administration and those key figures could come forward and say, let's talk about this and talk about the mistakes, I think that could do more to bring people together in this country than anything. There are, of course, people who would use that to say, well, the one party is wrong, but those would be unfortunate people.
No, I agree. I think that it's, we all are to blame for what happened in Afghanistan. And I don't think anybody really is looking for like this guy and this person and this year on this decision was the one that hinged on it and all went falling down.
Yeah.
Because that's unrealistic. It's a 20-year war. It spanned 4 different administrations, both parties and all that type of stuff. Multiple general officers were involved in it, Secretary of Defenses and all that type of stuff. But talking about that is going to make sure that, the void is filled with the big T truth. If you look at, there's a great book called, what's it called? Bring the War Home. By Kathleen Bellow. I might be mispronouncing her last name. But basically, she looks at the modern white power movement after the Vietnam War. And what she found was that they preyed on Vietnam veterans with a message of bring the war home, that you were betrayed by the elites, right, for what happened in Vietnam, and that they don't care, and that you didn't really lose. They stole it from you, and they're to blame. And so come with us, and you can join us. And obviously there's some similarities between the modern white power movement, the Proud Boys, and all that type of stuff. And I'm not an expert on that, but there's a lot of similarities there. And not the vast majority of veterans will never join a radical movement like that, but there's going to be enough that do. And I think there's going to be a lot of people that is more and more Afghan veterans, especially people who did their whole lives in Afghanistan. And that's my whole career, is a global war on terrorism. And people like me are leaving the service, retiring. As we leave, these are the type of people that are going to be more susceptible to it. Because their whole narrative has gone up in smoke. The whole narrative of, where you are, with the way that the NEO went down, for a lot of people, that narrative has been challenged.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of interesting challenges on that too, that then start to, without the truth, there's a vacuum, and you're right, it leaves a lot of room for conspiracy theories almost to crop up of what happened here. And that's why it's so important to figure out and to talk about it, to have a national conversation, to get everyone talking about it too, not just the people who fought in the country, but to have us all understand what happened, even if we didn't go there ourselves. I wondered if you could talk a little bit, you mentioned in a recent Twitter thread having experienced moral injury in Iraq. And I think you said that earlier too. What was that like? How did that come to pass? Because that's a different conflict with, a very different set of...
I was in Baghdad in 2006. Not a very good time to be in Baghdad. I was on a police transition team training the Iraqi police, the Air Force Security Forces Squadron. That moral injury, and I didn't know what it was at the time because a lot of my symptoms first were combat PTSD related.
Mm-hmm.
But the more and more I got past like the initial problems, the more I realized that there was some other stuff going on here. And for that, it was stuff like, I was partnering with people that were murderers, rapists, torturers, Iraqi security forces that were, part of Shia militias, Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army, that were going into areas and pulling Sunnis out and murdering them. and bringing them back to our Iraqi police station. I write about this in a in an article for the Bulwark called "Moral Injuries." So that is one aspect of it, and it's also a betrayal by a higher authority, but over something of critical importance, because you're there to partner and assist with somebody who you're told that they're going to be an ally. And for us at that point in time, a lot of the Iraqi police were just trying to kill us, and there was a lot of brutality that we saw, and a lot of things that we had to do that went against what we considered right. Jonathan Shea talks about that, what you consider right, and for us, that happened again and again and again. And I talk about that in that article about, for just a small anecdote, we picked up an interpreter out of an Iraqi police station, but I was not able to take him into the IZ at the time. And I was told by higher headquarters that I had to drop him off in the middle of nowhere because it was getting late at night in a insurgent infested area. And I can only imagine that he probably did not survive that incident. So that type of event, right, it's a betrayal of what I consider right. And I knew it right at the time, but there was nothing I could do about it. And so that type of moral injury is something that really affected a lot of people in Iraq. It's different, right? It's different from the NEO, but it's still the things that you go in there. You're going to be this type of person. You're going to do these type of things, but then you're put in a test where you are having to do something that is against your code, and you have no alternative but to do so.
Yeah. Oh, I never thought about, because Afghanistan, there were definitely things like that too. I talked to one Afghanistan veteran. He had been Army National Guard, and he agreed to meet with me because I was at the time writing a book about Sangin, and I had never set foot in Afghanistan despite having applied to multiple jobs in Afghanistan to set foot in Afghanistan. But he and his twin had served at Camp Phoenix together, and his job was to help get convoys of Afghan trucks loaded up, and so that they could take stuff through, I think, Pakistan to go to another base. But he, the truck drivers would often have little boys with them.
Yeah.
And they use those boys as bachabazi, which, for listeners who are not familiar with that concept, that's dancing boys. So they're used for sexual pleasure. And he would watch the truck drivers drive in and swap boys.
Yep.
And I could tell from the way he was describing it to me as he sat next to me, that still hurt him very badly. And I don't think that anybody had used that term, moral injury. And unfortunately, about a year after our interview, I got a call from the family friend who set up that interview, and his brother had committed suicide. And within 3 months, he had followed suit. And there was so much. And the VA, he would go to the VA and say, I need to see someone now. I'm struggling. It wasn't just, the men and the boys in the trucks. It was all the things. It was having a 3-year-old, not knowing if a 3-year-old was going to pick up a weapon and come after him. All of this uncertainty that was never, named, and he had to deal with it on a constant basis. There was a lot of things going on for him, and it's heartbreaking, because that was a man who also, when I met with him, someone had failed to put the flag to half mast at his workplace, and he wasn't having it. He sent out a memo to the whole company, and he's like, that needs to be done. And nobody did anything about it. He went out there and he just made it happen because that mattered to him. He was somebody who was going to do amazing things for this country.
So I cannot hear you right now.
He didn't get the help that he needed. And he did things that were contrary to what he thought was right. And just, you always wonder, could we have done more to prepare him beforehand? Could we have done more to make sure that things like bachabazi were not happening on an American base? Just what can we do to protect at the time and to help afterwards? Because these are not cultural norms.
No. I had the same type of stuff. I spent a year in Gorak, Kandahar, next to Sangin. doing village stability operations with a team from 7th Group. And yeah, that was a very common thing. I think for a lot of veterans, for a lot of active duty service members who saw that type of stuff, it's the moral compromises that you make with yourself, right? That you're going to deal with that type of stuff, that it's okay because it's for something that's greater than you. And then when Afghanistan came tumbling down, then you're like, why did I do that? Why did I suffer through that? All the different things that I did. For me personally, I missed the death of my father. I missed my wife's pregnancy. I was barely able to make it, and I went back home. And all the different things that I saw, all the bombs, all the killings, all the things, and then to watch it all come tumbling down. It was the first month of the Neo was hard. But it was just so much. It was just so much action, that you were able to just kind of like push your way through it. But then the months that happened afterwards, and seeing it all fall apart, and just being around everybody who was going through the trauma with you, if you were a part of the evac effort, it was. It was the worst year of my life. The first year. It was just brutal, and I was in command, and like I was struggling, and I was very lucky that. The Air Force group that I'm a part of has something called an Airman Resiliency Team. And we have, a psychologist, a chaplain there. And the psychologist that I was able to go to had dealt with moral injury. And so he was really good. But I tell you what, it was devastating. I thought I had seen everything war had to offer. But when that came tumbling down, everything that I had done, I re-examined it and was like, what did I do this for? And I think that is what moral injury can be. It can just change your entire narrative of what you were doing, like the story that you tell yourself, what's right. And when that happens, my mother is a professor at Texas State University, and she deals with a lot of veteran students there. And she says that for a lot of them, after Afghanistan, betrayal became their narrative. And you could see their grades start to drop, boom, 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 because they didn't have anybody to talk to, and all they saw was that nothing really went wrong. And we should all be thankful for what happened in the Neo, and people did an incredible job. It's just Herculean effort. It's the best of the military, right? And then the evacuation stuff that's happened was just a remarkable effort that continues on today. But like that doesn't hide the fact that all the rest happened too. That's still this over here. Like just because this is amazing doesn't mean that this didn't also happen. And we have to talk about it, because if not, you want to love veterans, you want to love the active duty service members, you want to love them and you support them. This is the real support. Like sitting there and listening to somebody cry because all the stuff that they saw. And I tell you, there is a mountain of contempt, and I see it often, that people feel like they serve for a country that, they'll buy you a beer, but they're not going to listen to the story about the dead girl that you saw on the side of the road.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and they can't often talk about that.
Right.
So I wanted, when there was no chaos from my Perch comment came out, was it Kirby who said that? I wrote about it, and I got a lot of people who wanted to tell me about it, but none of them could give me their names because they're still in the military. And I understand that, but also I hope that they're talking about it inside their command structure, because they had a lot to say and they were feeling a lot of things. And we had then, Michael and I actually did a small round table of people who were there who could come on and talk about it. And the things that we heard, I've seen a lot in my life. I've covered, I've done a lot of Holocaust research that I've seen pictures of things I never hoped to see in reality. And I've heard stories and listened to them, and listening to them talk, these veterans at HKIA, I was almost crying on multiple occasions, because it was hard. It was hard to hear it. And then at the very end, one of the young men talked about how he almost killed himself when he
Mm-hmm.
came home. And one
Yeah.
of the people in his unit did kill himself,
Mm-hmm.
and multiple people struggled with that. And it just reminded me of the importance of listening.
Yeah.
Listening and having a place to go. And for them, they most of the people who joined us that day had joined OAR Foundation,
Mm-hmm.
Operation Allies Refuge, I
Mm-hmm.
believe. And that was a place where they could all talk and go over the things that they'd seen that nobody else wanted to hear about. And I think that that's a great thing, but it needs to be bigger, and we need to reach more people with it, because it's not just the people who were at HKIA, it's the
Oh
people
yeah.
who watched the provinces that they fought in fall,
Oh man,
or
I
who,
mean,
yeah,
it was
had.
brutal.
Mhm.
I tell people that I have seen. Look, I'm not like I didn't kill Bin Laden or all that type of stuff. I'm not some like you know door kicker, all that type of stuff. But I've seen enough of war that I know what I know. I've seen enough of combat. I've seen all the horrors that are associated with it. Um, and that year was the worst. It was way worse. I mean, it was way worse. It's not even close. It nearly destroyed me. I mean, it nearly destroyed me. I just I mean, I would come home. I mean, I'm a commander. I have pretty long. It's a pretty big job. I would come home. I would put 6 hours in. You know, I had a bunch of interpreters that I got out previously who were SIVs, American citizens, and I was just like working the phones, trying to get people out. You know, after the fall and after we left, it was like the Wild West. You know, you were getting people in out anywhere you could, right? And as people were chartering planes, sneaking people out as before the bureaucracy came in and put a red tape around everything. Um, but I mean, I would sleep with a phone on my chest up as loud as I could, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night, get it, and start working. And I did that for a long time until I just collapsed. And the trauma from that alone, from that year alone, I'm still just trying to figure it out. I'm still just trying to figure it out. It has been the toughest thing I've ever gone through in my life because I tell people often, like, the military, nobody ever trains you how to lose a war, right? Nobody ever trains you how to lose a war, but nobody promises you they're going to win a war either. However, one of the things that we tell ourselves constantly is that we're not going to leave anybody behind, and that these principles are sacred. So when we don't uphold them, you can't expect people not to be completely crushed. And if we don't talk about that, and if our senior leaders don't create that permission structure, then there's going to be more and more problems, and it's going to manifest in things. I mean, there's at Fort Bragg or Fort Liberty, they've had a high rate of drug problems, suicide, all this type of stuff, and that is the base that was most associated with a lot of Afghanistan and the NEO. And there's a huge Rolling Stone articles about it, and you can see that the spike increased after the fall. And I see it
Wow.
all the time, and it's like the lights are blinking red, and I'm just trying to tell people, like, this is coming, and if we don't start doing something about it, it's going to metastasize.
Yeah. Well, I've seen too many. I follow a lot of veteran accounts on social media,
Mm-hmm.
and I've seen too many posts lately about suicides.
Yep.
And it breaks your heart, because you can tell that people are heartbroken and they're angry
They're
too,
very
because
angry.
those
They're
people
very
leave
angry.
behind families that
Yes.
needed them.
Sure.
And the young man that I wrote about had a beautiful little girl and a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful wife, and they needed him. And we
Yep.
need everyone. I mean, that's the thing, is the veteran community and the service member community, those are the most selfless people in this country.
Yes.
We need them
Yes.
so badly. We need
Yes.
their experiences. We need to hear about it. And there need to be more places where their voices are
Yeah.
heard.
We
And
need to create a structured spaces for people to discuss what happened so that they can forgive themselves.
it's
Or
such a
forgive
hard
them. It's a
thing.
very difficult thing, but if if you don't validate somebody's trauma, if you pretend like it doesn't exist, that hole will be filled by things that are going to make things worse.
Yeah. Well, and I think, like you say, the U.S. government has a role in that too. Every time that I send a message to the State Department asking for information about how many SIVs are left, how many priority 1 or priority 2 referrals to the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program have been accepted,
Sure.
And how many have been input, because that's a number that they don't want to give out either. They always just come back and say, well, we got this many people out in the evacuation. I'm like, that's great. What about all the ones you left? What about all of those people? And many of them have an American behind them who is not only affected in an emotional way, but many of them are paying money. I mean, how
Sure.
many of these veteran
Oh,
evacuation
my.
groups, people have liquidated their retirement accounts,
Yes.
liquidated their children's
Yes.
education accounts,
Yep.
lost their, I mean, I've been through this too, divorce in the
Yep.
aftermath of the withdrawal, because
Yes.
that's not the only reason for me, but like, you know, these are big things
Yeah.
that people are going through because they are so fixated on how do we fix this? Like, what is the toll of this withdrawal is far more than just like, you know, blood on our hands, for lack of a
No, I think
better.
that, it's the same thing that I always try to say. Yes, great things happened then. It was an amazing
Mhm.
effort, and everybody should be proud of what they did. We all
Mhm.
should be proud. But, like, people fell off of a plane trying to evacuate, trying to get out. Like, and God bless the people that made it out, and I'm happy for all of them. But a lot of people who weren't in Kabul, were outside of it, were the ones that we really put in a bad place, right? Because they were our allies out in really hostile areas. I mean, I can't tell you the amount of tribal elders that I was able to work with. Everybody has a superpower in the military. Some people are great fighters. Some people are bureaucratic knife fighters. Some people can see a map. I was really good with Afghans, and I could talk to Afghan elders and kind of convince them to join us. And I mean, I can only imagine where some of them are. Right? Didn't make it for sure. And so we have all these people who put their whole life on the line for the last 20 years, and now it just kind of recedes to black, and it's just very difficult. And yes, heroic stuff, but we still left people behind, and we need to talk about it and admit it and say to people and tell people, like our senior leaders, to tell them, like, yes, but these are the things that are going on now. I talk to most people and they have no idea that these efforts continue today. They have no idea, no idea. And so, like, I'm out there telling them, yes, it's bad. There's still people are still trying to get people relocated out of Afghanistan, and this work is still going on. But most people don't know. And so,
No.
like, having that conversation is vitally important, because you give them a little bit of hope and you tell them, yeah, we messed this up, and these are the things we're going to do to fix it so the next time it doesn't happen again. And for a lot of active duty service members and veterans, at least they can hang their hat on that, right? They can hang that narrative hat on, like, okay, I did this didn't go right, but look, they're doing these things are going to be reformed. This is, the things that they're going to fix. So it was worth it because I'm doing something for my brothers and sisters in arms down the road, so it doesn't happen to them.
Yeah. And I think there are so many important efforts that can help people kind of reclaim what Afghanistan meant to them.
Yes.
And I think that that's the important thing right now, reclaiming the narrative, making a new one. And you know, for people who want to do that, there are great ways to make a difference, or to just talk through it, and come up with that new story. um are there any groups in particular that you think are doing a really good job at this right now?
Yeah, I think that, so, there's the whole Afghan evac coalition and all the different NGOs that are involved in it. I'm involved in one, Operation Sacred Promise. We're a loose coalition of different people. It's kind of changed since the last 2 years. I mean, we're not as big as we used to be. Life eventually had to move on, and that's that's difficult for people to be like, I have to let some of this go. I have to
Mm.
tell people that reach out to me that like I can't help you. I'm sorry, but yes, there's groups that are still. I mean, God bless, like still working to get Afghans out, that are advocating to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act, that are pushing the State Department to do more with P1s and P2s, that are trying to make sure that some of the people that have gotten out that are still in Doha or wherever, that they are able to get through this process. I had an American SIV, American citizen, whose mother languished in Doha for 18 months. She was a female, head of a female school in Logar, and helped the PRT in Logar for 10 years. But there was a number on her phone that was suspicious. I mean, and so 18 months. I mean, she finally came back. Yeah, and so yes, there's people that are doing stuff. There's a lot of groups, and I think for people to get involved, for me personally, my opinion is that call your congressman, call your senator, tell them to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. I think that would help a lot of people to point and say, look, we're giving a pathway to the Afghans that are here, a pathway to permanent residence.
Yeah, because so many of them now are coming up on 2 years.
Yep.
And I know that there's been, I think, did Biden make an executive order that people can petition to have
I think so.
their 2 years? It's all so confusing. And in
Yeah.
fact, I just had a colleague from my former workplace say, "Are you writing about this? Because it's not automatic, and people are
Right.
going to get screwed." And there's always more to report than there is interest in reporting
Sure.
or people being reported on. But there's just, and that's another problem is, all of this deserves to be brought to light. But I'm pretty sure if I ask the State Department, just for my benefit, I'd like to know this. I don't think they're going to come back and say, yeah, let me give you the numbers. They want to know that that's a request from a media organization, not some random freelancer who just really is interested in having this information for the record. There's just so much that needs to be brought to light. And I think
It is
that's the big thing here is we need to shine a light on all of this.
it's a multifaceted problem, and there's multiple different angles to it. The tragedy, but there's a lot of great stories of hope. And if people really want to see, it is the best part of veterans, the best part of civilians, and the best part of service that you can see is what's been going on over the last 2 years. There's a lot of just incredible people that I've met over the last 2 years. Just some superstars that have what they have done to get people out it is mind-boggling to me. I mean, like you said, some of them have drained their bank accounts just to try to get families out. For to uphold that promise that we made. I mean, I made to people that I wasn't going to forget about them. I mean, that's what the government trained me to do. They trained me. I was an Afghan hand. They trained me to go and make friends with the Afghans so they would trust us so that we could fight shoulder to shoulder. And I was really good at it. And so were a lot of other people. And it's hard to turn that off. And for a lot of them, they continue to fight to try to get as many of them out as you can. But I know you've talked to many people, and for a lot of them, it's how many of them have had conversations where they've had to tell people, "I'm sorry, you can't bring your mom with you. I'm sorry,
Yep.
you can't bring your son with you because he's over 21. I'm sorry, you're going to have to leave them behind."
Yep.
I mean, those are the conversations that active duty and veterans and civilians have had and are having, continue to have. And they're the ones that carry that burden for the country and for the very people who fought in these wars over the last 20 years. They are the ones that are continue to carry the burden. And that's the tragedy of the all-volunteer military, right? Is that it was created after Vietnam to lessen the burden on the population, but it's overburdened a lot of people because not only do they fight the wars, but they're the only ones that grieve it.
Yeah, dealing with the aftermath of it. And And that's not even, I mean, imagine the toll for, Afghan SIVs who are here. I mean, you said,
Sure.
multiple.
Oh yeah.
There's one in particular, Passoon Khan. We had him on our show. I've been talking to Passoon since shortly after the withdrawal, and he went back into Afghanistan. This man witnessed when the important thing here is Passoon saw some shit in
Yeah.
combat, and
Sure.
he never stopped working. He worked and worked and worked until he survived an IED blast. And even after being in a coma, not able to see, having to relearn how to walk again, he went back to serve with the army until his SIV came through. And he came here, and then he wanted to get his dad and his mom and his siblings out. And the State Department wasn't moving fast enough, and his dad served in the NDS, the Intelligence Directorate, and he was absolutely a high value target. So Passoon flew to Kabul and made the Department of State take his family out, but the Department of State would only evacuate his parents. Wow. So his young brother is now being raised by his older siblings in Afghanistan. And this is a man who, to help his family pay for, because his dad now can't work, right? And his uncle couldn't work. He was working he did not take a single day off. He was working security shifts for 16 hours at a time, and then driving for Uber in every spare moment he had to be able to afford the multiple apartments that his family required to move around in so that they didn't get rolled up by the Taliban. I mean, it was just the things that people have had to go through because we did this. Yep. Somebody needs to calculate them. It's unbelievable to me. And for somebody like Passoon, this is something that was brought up after we finished recording, but where can he can't go to the VA for services.
Right. No.
He worked alongside our forces for years and years and years, but he doesn't rate anything like that.
Yeah.
And so he's dealing with all of this on his own. And he, the concept of even PTSD or anything that he might be experiencing, I'm not sure if he sees it as that. Maybe he does, who knows, but there's so much on that man's shoulders. Yeah, and there's no one coming to help him.
No, I have an interpreter who, he was my interpreter the last year there, and we got half of his family out. And so now the other half is still there. And so he is not only helping half of his family make this huge adjustment to life in America, which is enormous, big change, but he's also sending a lot of his money back to Kabul and trying to figure out ways to get them out because, nobody wants to be the family of an American SIV combat interpreter in Afghanistan.
No. And the sad thing is I have never met an Afghan who moved to another country and was well received there. This podcast wouldn't exist if I had not gone to the house of a neighbor who said to me, well, I don't think any Afghans should be here. Wow. And I said, oh, really? Even the ones who served with us and were right? No. And I said, what about all the Ukrainians who came over here after they're fine. They're white. And I should have reared back and done something horrible. But I said nothing. And I just called Mikael the next day and I said, we're going to do the podcast because we'd been waffling. Oh, you should do a podcast. No, you should do a podcast. And I said, no, we're doing this because people need to be able to hear the stories of Afghans and the stories of people like you. You've worked with Afghans. You care for them deeply. You would not care for Afghans deeply if they were not beautifully amazing people. Every Afghan I talk to on the internet, before they say anything, it's, how are you? How are things going for you? I mean, the Taliban could be at their door and they would be doing that.
Yeah, I tell you.
Lovely people.
Yeah, amazing people. When I was doing the NEO and I was calling people to tell them we were calling people, some of our contacts, and we weren't going to be able to get them out. I would say 75% of them just said, thank you for trying. And that was the worst part, right?
Yeah.
The ones that yelled were I took that a lot better. I understood that, right? I was like, totally get it, valid. But it was the ones that were like so kind to me, and they were just like, "Thank you, Will. Thank you for everything you've done for me. Don't forget about me. We're gonna, thank you for the last years and what America has done for Afghanistan." And you're just like completely blown away by it. Yeah,
Yeah. It's hard. I feel like it's funny. This episode might be more than any other. I feel like you've had to flay yourself open kind of and get to really the hard parts. Like, this is not easy. It's like we talked about earlier. Talking about this stuff is not easy. It dredges up really horrible feelings. And at the same time, knowing that somebody else is listening, and I know that there are going to be people who are going to listen to this and go, yep, I felt that. Yep. Like, it's all of these things are important to say. And I'm so glad that you joined me. I know Michael wanted to be here. Michael's having technical difficulties. That's why Michael's not here, in case anybody wants to know. He's probably listening right now and cursing me. But this is a really heavy conversation, but the heavy conversations are very important. So thank you for coming to do that with us. I do want to close. So we always close with a letter from an Afghan, and this is the longest letter that we have ever received. And I'm hoping that it doesn't make me cry. Okay. So I'm going to read the whole thing. And this is from Asadullah, this is the name we've given this young man, who is experiencing serious problems from hemophilia, and his father, Namatullah, has applied for an SIV and is hoping to be accepted. We actually received this story from an evacuation volunteer, so we are grateful to her and to Asadullah for sharing this with us. My name is Asadullah. I was born in 2002 in Western Afghanistan. When I was 6 months old, a piece of glass hit me and caused superficial bleeding. My mother tried to stop the bleeding with a cloth, but she did not succeed. My parents tried to take me to the International Security Assistance Force base, but because it was a military area, they could not enter. As they returned, they encountered an ISAF officer who saw me and asked my father to take me inside with him. Several doctors examined me and told my father I was suffering from hemophilia and needed to inject factor VIII. Unfortunately, they didn't have any. I was still bleeding, and I was in the hospital for 21 days until my father's friend, who lived in Iran, found factor VIII and sent it to my father. When they injected it, the bleeding stopped. My illness brought my parents into a new phase with different challenges. They have many problems, and now I can understand how they felt and how much they went through. My mother says when my teeth started to come in, my gums started to bleed. Imagine that. For many days, blood was flowing from my mouth. My parents knocked on every door to find blood and give me an injection. I looked at my parents' family. The majority of them gave me blood as a gift so I could survive. During these years, my parents sold most of the household items they had in order to get money to buy factor VIII. They were by my bed in the hospital day and night and didn't sleep as they prayed for my health. When I was 6, my teeth started to fall out, and the same bleeding started again. At that time, my father had managed to find a job with American forces in Afghanistan as a security guard. He was happy to have a good salary, but unfortunately, the Afghan government didn't provide any help to hemophiliac children. After a few years, with the help of foreign institutions that were active in the field of children's health, a department for hemophiliac children was created in the capital. A number of different factors were sent to Afghanistan every year. As each day passed, my parents had to be more careful with me because of my limitations. They didn't allow me to go out of the house and play with my friends. My mother told me that when she was pregnant with me, my father promised to take me to the best schools, regardless of whether I was a boy or a girl, so that I could study and become an educated person and serve the Afghan people. My mother said my father was unable to continue his education because he'd grown up poor, and he had to do hard work to help support his family, which is why he was still living in poverty while his school friends who continued their educations had high-paying jobs. My father didn't want me to be like him and not study, so they encouraged me to go to school, but they were still worried about my health. In the 4th grade, while I was playing with my friends at school, my foot slipped and I fell to the ground. My knee was injured and I bled into my muscle. I was hospitalized again, but due to the lack of sufficient facilities, the doctor told my father that he should take me to Pakistan for more tests. My treatment began in a hospital in Islamabad, but as a poor family without enough money for treatment, we had to go back to Afghanistan. Now, poverty has caused my right knee to become defective, which makes it difficult to walk. In 2020, when I was on my way home from school, I collided with a motorcycle. My left hand was hit and I suffered subcutaneous bleeding again. The doctor put my hand in a cast from the fingers to the elbow. My father told him about my illness, but the doctor angrily told him that he knew better. My hand was in a cast for 2 months. With every day that passed, my fingers became less mobile until I could hardly move them at all. When the cast was taken off, I couldn't move my wrist. I tried, but it didn't work. I screamed and asked for help, but my hand had no feeling and was paralyzed. Until that moment, I thought that fathers don't cry. Then my father started crying when he saw that my hand no longer had any feeling. My father did the most difficult things when he was working with American soldiers. Taliban and ISIS threatened to kill him several times, but he needed money to buy Factor 8. In response to them, he said, "My son's life depends on me." Life was no longer the same as before. When I went to school or outside the house, children mocked and insulted me. They wouldn't sit next to me in class. Some of the parents complained to the principal that my disease was contagious and I should be expelled from school. I had good grades and I liked studying. My notebook was full of letters from teachers saying encouraging words to me. My father heard some of the complaints and got angry. He took me to another school, but I had no more of my old enthusiasm. I missed my old friends, even though some of them have behaved badly towards me. Now I suffer from mental health problems and depression. I feel like I wasn't part of society and sometimes wondered if I exist at all. My new school was in a desert. I wasn't interested in studying like before. I wanted to play football, but I couldn't. In 2021, I was standing behind one of the gates when one of the children shot the ball and it hit me directly. The ball was very heavy. Everyone gathered around me. I opened my eyes and saw my parents above me, my mother crying, my father's eyes blurry. I couldn't even hear their voices correctly. The doctors suggested that I be taken to Sheikh Zayed Hospital in Kabul because I didn't have any Factor 8 and I was bleeding from my brain. I was hospitalized there, and with the support of the government, I was injected with Factor 8 several times. Then Afghanistan fell to the Taliban and the government fell apart. With the arrival of the Taliban, our problems doubled. On one hand, there was my illness and the lack of Factor 8. On the other hand, my father had to hide. He had worked for American forces for a long time. Those who threatened him, the Taliban, were present in the whole city. According to Sharia law, for all who worked with American soldiers, it was considered permissible or halal to shed their blood. Now, officially, my father could not work because of the fear of being exposed. He owed money to his friend, and there was no money to cover our expenses. The burden of mental pressure and stress made life hell for all of us. Somehow, I now had bleeding from my bladder too, which led me to be hospitalized for 4 months. During this time, my mother was by my side. She asked people who were blood relatives to give me blood. After a while, one of our acquaintances brought Factor 8 from Iran, and the bleeding from my bladder stopped. We had no chance in Afghanistan anymore, regardless of my illness. With the departure of the American soldiers and the Taliban gaining power, Afghanistan was no longer safe for allies of the American government. The Taliban had fought what to kill them. That's why they all decided to leave Afghanistan in different ways. My father sent his case to the National Visa Center of the American government and at the same time sent a request for help to one of the organizations that support Afghan refugees in America. Some time had passed and we heard nothing and were disappointed until my father received an email from June asking how she could help. And Asadullah goes on to say that June is his dear grandmother and that he very much appreciates how God sent her to save us. And he's very thankful to her. And I know that Asadullah is hopeful that his father's SIV will come through. So thank you so much to June and Asadullah for that story. Will, thanks again. I think, all of this kind of comes together. These are real people facing serious situations, and the people back home are still in need of truth and deep, difficult conversations. So thanks for coming and doing that with us or with
Thanks
me
for
today.
having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, as always, we want to thank all our listeners for taking the time to support the people of Afghanistan and Tasha Kaur, and we hope to see you again soon.